On the night of October 8th, 1871, a fire moved through a lumber town in northern Wisconsin faster than any person could outrun it. In the span of a few hours, it killed more people than any wildfire in American history has killed before or since. More people died in that one night than in the California wildfires of the 21st century combined. More than in any single fire ever recorded on this continent. Almost no one alive today knows the name of the town. That is not an accident of memory. It is a matter of timing. On that same night, in a city 250 miles to the south, a much smaller fire started on the outskirts of Chicago. That fire killed a few hundred people and burned out the heart of a major American city, and it became one of the most famous disasters in the country's history. The fire in Wisconsin killed as many as 2,500 people in a town most Americans had never heard of. Within a week, it had all but vanished from the national conversation. This is the story of how a lumber town at the edge of Lake Michigan became the deadliest fire in United States history. It is the story of why the world outside barely noticed and why the conditions that produced it are still being recreated today in different forests under different names. This is Quiet History at Bedtime. If this is the kind of story that holds your attention, a subscribe means everything right now. Every detail in this account comes from government archives, legislative records, and current academic research on the period. Just relax and let this play as you drift into sleep. Now, let us begin. Peshtigo sat on the river that gave it its name, a few miles inland from the western shore of Green Bay, in the northeastern corner of Wisconsin. In 1871, it was not yet 20 years old as an organized town, and it had grown the way most towns in that part of the country grew in that decade, around a mill and around the trees that fed it. The forest surrounding Peshtigo was white pine, red pine, hemlock, and cedar, standing in stands so dense that early surveyors described the canopy as blocking out the sun for miles at a stretch. To the lumber industry of the mid-19th century, this was not scenery, it was inventory. The United States, after the Civil War, was rebuilding and expanding at a pace the country had never seen before. Chicago, St. Louis, and a dozen smaller cities were laying out new streets, new rail lines, and new housing developments by the thousand, and every one of those structures needed lumber. Wisconsin's pine forests sat almost directly north of the largest lumber market in the country. Rivers like the Peshtigo, the Wolf, and the Menominee gave loggers a way to move felled timber south toward Green Bay and Lake Michigan without building a single mile of road. The business model was simple, and it was proven. Cut the trees in winter, when snow made it possible to drag logs on sledges. Float them downriver in spring, when the snowmelt raised the water high enough to carry them. Mill them into lumber near the mouth of the river, and ship the finished product south by boat. Peshtigo existed because that model worked, and because one company decided to build its operation at exactly that spot on the river. The Peshtigo Company was owned by William B. Ogden, a businessman whose name does not appear often in general histories of the American Midwest, but whose decisions shaped a significant part of it. Ogden had been the first mayor of Chicago, elected in 1837, and by the 1850s he had moved from city government into railroads, real estate, and timber. building a fortune from the infrastructure that a growing country needed and did not yet have. His investment in Peshtigo was not sentimental. The town sat on a river with reliable flow, in a forest with valuable timber, within reach of a market that could absorb almost unlimited lumber. Ogden built a sawmill there, and beside it, a second facility that manufactured wooden household goods, pails, tubs, broom handles, and similar items, turning raw timber into finished products without ever leaving company land. By 1871, the Peshtigo Company's woodenware factory was one of the largest of its kind in the country, employing several hundred workers directly and supporting several hundred more indirectly through logging camps, teamster crews, and river drives that fed the mill. Ogden's fortune was not built on lumber alone. He held interests in railroads stretching across the upper Midwest, in Chicago real estate, and in a range of manufacturing ventures that made him one of the wealthiest men in the region by the time the Peshtigo operation reached full production. That breadth of investment meant Ogden's business empire had exposure in more than one city at once, though neither he nor anyone else in 1871 had reason to think about that exposure in terms of fire risk. Chicago was where his money largely lived. Peshtigo was where a significant share of the raw material that fed Chicago's growth was cut, milled, and shipped south. The two cities were connected by more than Ogden's investments. Wisconsin lumber, moved south by boat across Lake Michigan, had supplied a substantial portion of the wood used to rebuild and expand Chicago through the 1850s and 1860s, feeding a city that was itself constructed almost entirely of the same combustible material as the town that supplied it. Neither city's builders treated that shared vulnerability as connected, because in the ordinary run of a decade, fires in one location had no bearing on conditions in another 250 miles away. By October of 1871, that assumption was about to be tested in a way no one in either city could have anticipated. The logic of the river drive shaped almost every part of how the company organized its year. Logging crews worked through the winter months, felling timber and hauling it by sledge to the riverbank, while snow cover made the ground passable, and stacking it in position to wait for the spring melt. When the ice broke and the Peshtigo River rose with snowmelt each spring, crews of river drivers guided the accumulated logs downstream to the mill, a dangerous seasonal job that employed men skilled at balancing on floating timber and breaking up log jams before they could back up the river. The mill then ran through summer and into autumn, converting the winter's harvest into finished lumber and shipping it out by boat before the lake froze again. This cycle had repeated for years by 1871, and it had made Peshtigo a genuinely prosperous town by the standards of a rural lumber settlement. Wages at the mill were steady. The company store extended credit against future pay, a system common to lumber towns across the region that tied workers to the company through debt as much as through employment, and that made steady work at Peshtigo a meaningful improvement over the seasonal uncertainty many laborers had known elsewhere. For a workforce built largely from recent immigrants and migrants from the rural East, Peshtigo represented, in the plainest economic terms, an improvement over what most of them had left behind. It was not a wealthy town, and it was not an easy one, but by the standards its residents could reasonably compare it to, it was a place where a family could expect to do better this year than last. White pine was the most valuable species in the forest surrounding Peshtigo, prized for lumber that was light, easy to work, and resistant to warping, qualities that made it the preferred material for the frame construction going up across Chicago and the rest of the rebuilding Midwest. A single mature white pine, milled correctly, could produce enough lumber to frame a significant portion of a small house, and the forests north of Green Bay held stands of pine numbering in the millions of trees. Red pine and hemlock rounded out the harvest, used for framing lumber and, in the case of hemlock bark, stripped and sold separately to tanneries that needed the tannic acid it contained to process leather. Cedar, more resistant to rot than the other species, went toward shingles, fence posts, and railroad ties, giving the Peshtigo Company multiple product lines from a single logging operation rather than dependence on lumber prices alone. This diversity of product was itself a business decision, reducing the company's exposure to price swings in any one market and keeping the mill running through demand cycles that might otherwise have left it idle. It was, by the standards of 1871, a well-run operation, and its success was precisely what had drawn several hundred workers and their families to build a life around it. A town grew up around that operation because a workforce needed somewhere to live, and because a company town, in the economics of the period, was often more profitable to operate than to abandon to outside development. Ogden's company built housing, a company store, and the basic infrastructure of a small industrial settlement, and by the early 1870s, Peshtigo had a population estimated between 1,700 and 2,000 people, depending on how the surrounding logging camps and outlying settlements were counted. The people who filled that workforce came from several directions at once. Some were native-born Americans moving north and west in search of work, following the same logic that had built lumber towns across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota throughout the middle of the century. A significant share were immigrants, Scandinavian, German, French-Canadian, and Irish laborers, drawn by wages that, whatever their hardships, were often better than what they had left behind. None of this required the workers themselves to be named or tracked individually, and most were not. What the historical record does preserve is the shape of the town they built. Rows of wood frame houses, a hotel, several boarding houses for unmarried laborers, churches serving different immigrant communities, and streets that, by every surviving account, were covered in a fine layer of sawdust from the mill that ran day and night at the center of town. A Scandinavian millwright who had arrived in Peshtigo 3 years earlier, his name lost to the record along with most of his neighbors, would have followed a routine common to hundreds of workers in the town. 6 days a week, he reported to the mill before sunrise, took his midday meal at a boarding house table shared with a dozen other laborers, and spent evenings in a small rented room paid for out of wages the company itself had advanced against. Families who had managed to bring wives and children built or rented small frame houses along the streets nearest the mill, close enough to hear its saws running from morning until night. A general store carried goods on credit against the next payday, a common arrangement in company towns of the period, and church services were held in more than one language, reflecting the mix of Scandinavian, German, and French-Canadian communities that had settled around the mill in overlapping waves through the 1860s. None of this made Peshtigo unusual. It made it typical, a fully ordinary example of the hundreds of lumber towns that had sprung up across the pine belt of the upper Midwest in the years after the Civil War, each one organized around the same mill, the same river, and the same wooden buildings packed close together for convenience rather than safety. That sawdust was not incidental. A sawmill of Peshtigo's size produced waste wood by the ton, bark, sawdust, offcuts, and shavings, far more than any single operation could use, and in the economics of the period, disposing of it was treated as a minor operational cost rather than a hazard to be managed. Some of it was burned in controlled piles near the mill. Some of it was simply left where it accumulated, along fence lines, behind buildings, and in the gaps between structures that had been built quickly and close together to house a growing workforce. Every building in Peshtigo, without meaningful exception, was constructed of wood. The houses were wood frame. The sidewalks were wooden planks, raised above streets that turned to mud in wet weather and dust in dry weather. The mill itself, the largest structure in town, was built almost entirely of wood, packed with wood dust and stocked with wood in every stage of processing, from raw logs to finished lumber stacked in yards outside. This was not unusual for the period. Almost every town built around a 19th century sawmill looked the same way, because the economics of frontier construction favored the cheapest and most immediately available material, and that material was, obviously, wood. Brick and stone existed as building materials in 1871, and larger cities used them for major structures, but transporting either into a remote lumber town on the Peshtigo River made little economic sense when the alternative was standing in the mill yard, freshly cut and effectively free. A wood frame building could be raised in a fraction of the time a masonry structure required, using labor the company already employed and material the company already produced, and in a town built to house a growing workforce as quickly as possible. That calculation determined almost every structure on almost every street. The result, by 1871, was a town in which the raw material of catastrophe was not hidden in any one location, but distributed evenly through nearly every building, every sidewalk, and every yard. The mill held raw and processed lumber. The streets held sawdust. The houses, the boarding houses, the company store, and the hotel were built of the same material the mill produced, finished only weeks or months before, with wood cut from the same forest that surrounded the town on every side. What made this arrangement dangerous was not any single decision. It was the accumulation of many ordinary decisions made for ordinary reasons, none of which accounted for fire risk as a serious variable. Beyond the town itself, the land that had been logged over the preceding decades told a similar story. When loggers cut a stand of pine, they took only the trunk, the part with commercial value, and left the branches, treetops, and smaller limbs where they fell. This debris was known in the industry as slash, and by 1871, decades of logging around Peshtigo had left the surrounding forest floor littered with it, in some areas to a depth of several feet. Slash dried out faster than living trees and burned hotter and faster once ignited, and clearing it was, at the time, understood as basic land management rather than a precaution against catastrophe. Farmers moving into cleared timberland used fire deliberately, burning slash and stumps to open fields for planting, a practice so routine across the rural Midwest that state agricultural bulletins of the period described it as an ordinary autumn chore rather than a risk. The logic behind this practice was straightforward, and in most years it worked exactly as intended. A farmer clearing 5 or 10 acres for the following spring's planting could not remove felled trees by hand in any reasonable amount of time, and burning was faster, cheaper, and required no equipment beyond a match and a willingness to watch the fire until it went out on its own. In a normal autumn, with regular rainfall keeping the surrounding forest floor damp, These fires stayed where they were set. They burned the intended acreage, consumed the slash and stumps within it, and extinguished themselves against wet ground or were doused by the next rain, leaving behind cleared, blackened fields ready for spring plowing. Small fires, in other words, were not unusual around Peshtigo in any given year. What was unusual in 1871 was the weather that surrounded them. The summer of 1871 had been dry across the entire upper Midwest, and by early autumn, that dryness had become the defining condition of the season. Rainfall through the summer and into September had fallen well below normal levels across Wisconsin, Michigan, and parts of Minnesota, and rivers that would normally have carried meaningful flow by October were running low. The forest floor, already carrying years of accumulated dried along with everything else. Streams that loggers relied on to move timber began to run shallow. Wells in some communities dropped low enough to cause concern among residents who had never seen a season like it. Later meteorological reconstructions of the period, drawing on surviving weather station records and newspaper accounts from across the region, would show that the summer of 1871 ranked among the driest on record for the upper Midwest, following a pattern of below-normal precipitation that stretched back through the spring. Farmers who had cleared land the previous autumn without incident had no way of knowing that this particular year's drought had removed the margin of safety that ordinary caution depended on. Newspapers in Green Bay and Milwaukee had, by late summer, begun printing brief items noting the unusually low water levels in area rivers and the dust rising from roads that would normally have carried at least some moisture into October. These items ran as short notices among agricultural news, not as warnings, because nothing in the recent experience of the region suggested that a dry season, however severe, was different in kind from the dry seasons before it. None of this, on its own, alarmed anyone in Peshtigo enough to change behavior. Land-clearing fires continued through September, as they always had, set by farmers and small landholders across the region. Each one a routine, contained decision that made sense on the day it was made. Peshtigo was not an isolated case. Across northeastern Wisconsin and into the upper peninsula of Michigan, dozens of towns had grown up on the same model over the preceding 2 decades: a mill, a river, a stand of pine, and a workforce housed in wood-frame buildings pressed close together. Marinette and Menominee sat along the same stretch of coastline where the Menominee River met Green Bay, built on nearly identical logic to Peshtigo's own. Smaller settlements with names like Sugarbush dotted the farmland carved out of cleared timber further inland, populated by families who had taken up small holdings once the pine around them had been cut and hauled away. Each of these communities carried the same accumulated slash in its surrounding forest, the same wooden construction in its town center, and the same drought conditions drying out both by the first week of October. None of them had been built with fire risk as a shared regional concern, because no one organizing the settlement pattern of the Pine Belt had reason to think of these towns as connected to one another at all, beyond the rivers and rail lines that moved lumber between them. By the first week of October, the ground beneath Peshtigo's forests, the slash, the fallen branches, the dry undergrowth built up over decades of logging, had become something closer to fuel than to forest floor. No one in the town understood it that way yet. The mill ran on its normal schedule. The boarding houses filled each evening with workers finishing their shifts. The company store did its usual trade, and the wooden sidewalks carried the same foot traffic they carried every other week of that autumn. 60 miles away, and then 30, and then closer still, other fires were already burning, fires that had started weeks earlier, for the same ordinary reasons, in the same tinder-dry conditions, spread across a landscape that had no framework, no agency, and no precedent for treating a season of small fires as the leading edge of something else entirely. By the last week of September, 1871, fire was no longer an isolated event anywhere in the region around Peshtigo. It had become a background condition of the season. Small blazes were burning in woodlots and cut-over land across northeastern Wisconsin, most of them set deliberately by farmers clearing ground for spring planting. Under normal conditions, each of these fires would have stayed contained to the acreage it was meant to clear. That autumn, conditions were not normal. The drought that had settled over the upper Midwest since summer had left the region's fires burning longer, spreading wider, and resisting the kind of casual extinguishing that a wet season would have provided almost automatically. Newspapers in small towns across Wisconsin and Michigan had begun, through late September, to note smoke on the horizon on days when no rain was expected to clear it. In several communities, residents reported a haze thick enough to dim the sun at midday, a condition usually associated with a single nearby fire, but now stretching across multiple counties at once. None of these reports, taken individually, suggested anything beyond an unusually dry autumn. What they did not capture, because no one at the time had the tools to capture it, was that dozens of separate fires across a multi-state region were now drawing on the same exhausted reserve of moisture, and that the margin separating a contained burn from an uncontained one had grown dangerously thin. The lumber industry itself was adding fuel to that condition, though not through the slash-and-burn practices of individual farmers. Railroad construction crews working through the cut-over forest land of Wisconsin and Michigan followed their own version of land clearing by fire, burning brush and debris along new rail right-of-way to speed construction and reduce the cost of manual clearing. This practice differed from a farmer's contained field burning in one significant way. The debris burned along a rail line often ran for miles in a continuous corridor, rather than being confined to a single fenced field. A rail crew's fire, once lit, had a natural path to travel along. The cleared corridor itself, lined on both sides by the same dried slash that had made the region's forests so vulnerable through the drought. Crews generally expected these fires to burn themselves out at the edge of the cleared right-of-way, a reasonable assumption in a normal year when the forest beyond the clearing held enough moisture to resist ignition. Supervisors overseeing construction schedules had every incentive to keep this practice going through the autumn, since burning debris remained the fastest and cheapest way to clear a right-of-way ahead of track-laying crews working against a construction timetable set months in advance. Slowing or halting that work to wait for wetter conditions was not a decision any individual foreman had the authority or the institutional reason to make on his own. 1871 was not that year. Embers carried on dry wind found no such resistance waiting for them at the tree line. A construction crew working a new rail spur north of Peshtigo. That September followed a routine common to line crews across the region. Fell timber along the surveyed path, stack the resulting brush in windrows to the side of the cleared grade, and burn the windrows once enough had accumulated to make the work worthwhile. In a wetter year, the fire from one of these windrows would have consumed the brush and gone out against the damp ground within a day. That September, crews reported windrow fires that continued to smolder for days rather than hours, occasionally flaring back to life along their edges when the wind picked up in the afternoon. No single crew treated this as more than an inconvenience requiring closer monitoring, because nothing in the accumulated experience of railroad construction in the region had suggested that a smoldering brush fire could become anything more than a smoldering brush fire. The same crews who returned each morning to check a windrow's progress had in most cases no formal training in fire behavior beyond what practical experience had taught them. And practical experience in a normal year taught that a brush fire left alone would simply burn itself out. That lesson, reliable for years, was about to prove catastrophically wrong under conditions no one on any crew had encountered before. By the last days of September and the first week of October, fires that had started as routine land clearing, whether by farmers or by rail crews, were beginning to merge in places, burning across property lines that had never been relevant to a forest fire before, because no forest fire had ever been large enough to reach them. A fire that began on one farmer's cleared acreage might, under drought conditions, smolder undetected along its edge for days before a shift in wind carried it into an adjoining woodlot. From there, it could travel through accumulated toward a neighboring farmer's own land-clearing fire, still burning from a week earlier, and the two would become, in effect, a single fire covering ground that no individual landowner had any way of monitoring or controlling. This process repeated itself in different combinations across dozens of properties and multiple counties through the final days of September, each merger going largely unnoticed because no single observer stood in a position to see more than the fire nearest to them. This pattern was not unique to the area immediately around Peshtigo. Across the wider region, from the shores of Lake Michigan into Ontario to the north and as far south as Iowa, the same drought was producing the same effect: small, ordinary fires, refusing to behave like small, ordinary fires. Across the lake in Michigan, the same drought and the same land-clearing habits had already produced fires large enough to threaten entire counties in the weeks before October 8th. Settlements in the Thumb region of the state, an area of Michigan built on the same lumber economy as northeastern Wisconsin, were already dealing with fires that outstripped anything local residents had fought before, though the worst of that destruction there was still days away. Taken together, the fires burning across Wisconsin, Michigan, and the border areas of Canada through late September and early October represented one of the largest simultaneous fire events North America had experienced to that point, though no single observer at the time had a vantage point broad enough to recognize it as one connected phenomenon, rather than a string of unrelated local troubles. Contemporary accounts from the period describe entire counties shrouded in smoke for days at a stretch, with visibility on some roads reduced to a few hundred feet even in the middle of the afternoon. Farmers in parts of Michigan reported livestock refusing to graze in fields where smoke hung low enough to sting the eyes, and riverboat captains on Lake Michigan noted that smoke from onshore fires occasionally reduced visibility on open water far enough from land that the source fire itself could not be seen. Well to the south, in Chicago, that same haze had been noticeable enough through late September that some residents commented on a persistent smell of smoke drifting into the city on days when the wind came from the north. The city's own vulnerability to fire had nothing to do with the wildfires burning across Wisconsin and Michigan, since Chicago's danger came from its own densely packed wooden buildings, rather than from any nearby forest. But the same regional drought that had dried out the pine belt had left Chicago's structures just as parched as everything else in the upper Midwest that autumn. Neither city knew, on the evening of October 8th, that each was about to experience the worst fire disaster in its history within the same handful of hours. The drought's effects reached beyond fire risk into the basic rhythms of rural life across the region that autumn. Grain prices in some Wisconsin markets rose through September as farmers reported reduced yields from crops that had struggled through a summer with too little rain, and livestock owners in several counties began selling animals earlier than usual, rather than risk feeding them through a winter with depleted hay stores. None of these pressures were understood, at the time, as connected to the fire risk building in the same forests that supplied the region's lumber economy. They were simply the ordinary hardships of a difficult growing season, the kind every farming community expected to weather every few years as a matter of course. What no observer in September 1871 could have known was the specific meteorological mechanism that was about to turn this widespread but still manageable condition into something categorically different. A 20th century reconstruction of the weather pattern, built from surviving station records and synchronized against newspaper accounts of wind and temperature across the region, later identified the sequence of atmospheric conditions that converged on the night of October 8th. A strong low-pressure system was moving into the upper Midwest from the west, carrying with it a cold front that would, under ordinary circumstances, have brought welcome rain to a drought-stricken region. Ahead of that front, however, a mass of unusually warm, dry air remained in place over Wisconsin, air that had been baking over parched ground for weeks with almost no moisture to temper it. When a cold front collides with a mass of warm, dry air sitting over a landscape already primed to burn, the physical result is not gentle. The temperature contrast between the two air masses generates strong surface winds, and those winds, moving across a region already dotted with active fires, functioned less like weather and more like a bellows. Individual fires that had been burning at a manageable pace for days or weeks suddenly had far more oxygen and far more wind driving them than they had ever had before. In several locations, separate fires that had been burning independently began, within hours, to merge into single, larger fire fronts, feeding on each other's heat and drawing in surrounding air with increasing force. This process fed itself in a way that ordinary fires do not. As a fire grows large enough and hot enough, it begins to generate its own localized weather, pulling in air from all directions to feed the combustion at its center and sending that heated air rising in a column that can, under the right conditions, produce winds far exceeding whatever the surrounding storm system was already generating. Modern wildfire science describes this process as a convective feedback loop, in which the fire's own rising heat draws surface-level air inward at increasing speed to replace what has risen, and that inward rush of air supplies the combustion at the fire's base with more oxygen than a still atmosphere ever could. The larger the fire grows, the stronger this self-generated wind becomes, and the stronger the wind becomes, the faster the fire is able to grow. A cycle that has no natural ceiling until it runs out of fuel, runs into water, or is broken by a genuine change in the surrounding weather. By the evening of October 8th, the fires converging from multiple directions around Peshtigo had grown large enough and had merged with enough of their neighbors to begin generating exactly this kind of self-sustaining wind. What had been, 12 hours earlier, A collection of large but separate brush and forest fires was becoming, in effect, a single weather system of its own, one built entirely out of heat, wind, and burning pine. Later analysis of the Peshtigo Fire's physical evidence: trees snapped and thrown in directions inconsistent with the prevailing regional wind and burn patterns, suggesting cyclonic rather than linear movement, would lead investigators to conclude that some portion of the fire's destructive force came from something closer to a fire-generated tornado than a conventional wildfire front. None of this mechanism was visible or knowable to the people living in and around Peshtigo on the morning of October 8, 1871. What was visible to anyone paying attention was a day that felt different from the days immediately before it. The air was unusually warm for early October, and a wind had picked up from the southwest that carried a heavier smell of smoke than residents had grown accustomed to over the preceding weeks. A farmer working a cleared field a few miles outside Peshtigo that morning, his name recorded nowhere in the surviving documentation of the disaster, would have noticed the same thing thousands of others across the region noticed: a sky that looked wrong for the hour, tinted amber even well before sunset, and a wind that kept building through the afternoon, rather than settling as it usually did. By early evening, that wind had grown strong enough to rattle loose shutters and send dust and ash spiraling through the streets of Peshtigo in visible eddies, a nuisance rather than an alarm to residents who had spent weeks already living with smoke on the horizon. The mill had run its normal shift that day, though on a reduced schedule, since October 8th fell on a Sunday and much of the workforce had the day free from milling duties. Workers had eaten their evening meal at the usual hour in the same boarding houses and family kitchens that had served the same purpose every night that season, with no indication in any surviving account that October 8th began as anything other than an ordinary, if unusually windy, Sunday evening. A shopkeeper's wife on one of the streets nearest the mill, her name likewise absent from the surviving record, would have spent that Sunday much as she spent every other, tending a household routine built around church in the morning, and a quiet evening once the day's chores were finished. Like most of her neighbors, she had grown accustomed enough to the smell of smoke over the preceding weeks that the particular thickness of it that evening registered, at most, as a passing observation rather than a cause for concern. Children in several households were sent to bed at the usual hour, despite the noise of the wind outside, a detail that would matter enormously within a few hours, though nothing about the moment itself suggested urgency to the parents making that ordinary decision. Sunday itself mattered to the town's rhythm in a way that would only become significant in hindsight. Many residents were indoors earlier than on a working weekday, some already settling in for the night, in houses built entirely of the same dry, resin-rich pine that had made the surrounding forest so valuable and was now, in the strengthening wind, becoming something else entirely. Outside of town, the fires that had been burning for days in the surrounding cutover land and along the rail corridor were no longer separate, contained events, driven by the same wind residents in Peshtigo were noticing as an inconvenience. They had begun moving toward the town at a speed that nothing in the collective experience of anyone living there had prepared them to expect. A wildfire under normal conditions moves at a pace a person can outrun, or at least outwalk, given reasonable warning. The fire now approaching Peshtigo, driven by wind that meteorological reconstruction would later estimate at speeds approaching hurricane force, was not moving at that pace. There was no warning system in Peshtigo in 1871 beyond word of mouth and the direct evidence of one's own senses, no telegraph alert network monitoring wildfire conditions, no organized evacuation plan for a town built entirely around the assumption that fire, if it came, would come the way it always had, slowly enough to fight, or at minimum, slowly enough to walk away from. The telegraph did exist by 1871, and lines connected many towns in the region to the outside world for commercial and administrative purposes. What did not exist was any institution tasked with using that network to track fire conditions across multiple counties and issue warnings before a fire arrived, a function that would not become a formal responsibility of any American government agency for several more decades. Firefighting itself, where it existed at all in a town like Peshtigo, meant a volunteer bucket brigade and whatever hand tools a mill town kept on hand for its own operational fires, useful against a burning building or a contained brush fire, and entirely inadequate against a wind-driven wall of flame moving faster than a person could run. As night fell on October 8th, that assumption was still holding, even as the wind outside grew loud enough to be heard over ordinary conversation, even as the smell of smoke thickened past anything the town had experienced in the weeks leading up to it. A wind-driven crown fire, of the kind now bearing down on Peshtigo, does not move the way a fire moves across open ground. It moves through the tops of the trees themselves, jumping from crown to crown, ahead of whatever is burning at ground level, carried by wind that can fling burning bark and pine needles well over a mile ahead of the main fire front. Those airborne embers, landing on dry roofs, dry sidewalks, and dry sawdust in a town that had spent decades accumulating exactly that kind of fuel, meant that Peshtigo did not need the fire itself to arrive at its edge before buildings inside the town began to burn. The fire could ignite the town from a distance, one ember at a time, faster than any bucket brigade could respond to a single new blaze, let alone dozens appearing within the same few minutes. This is what separated the fire converging on Peshtigo from an ordinary forest fire reaching an ordinary town. A conventional fire gives residents time to see it coming, to judge its distance, and to decide when to leave. A fire capable of throwing ignition sources more than a mile ahead of itself compresses that decision-making window down to almost nothing, because the danger is no longer only in front of the town. It is already landing on the roofs above people's heads, while the main fire front is still out of sight. Somewhere beyond the tree line, in forest already primed by years of accumulated slash and months of drought, the fires that had been burning separately for days had become one fire, wide enough to blot out the horizon, and it was no longer moving toward Peshtigo. It had arrived at the edge of it. The first sound most residents would later describe was not a crackle or the smell of smoke growing stronger by degrees. It was a roar, low and continuous, rising out of the southwest faster than anyone standing in the street that night could reconcile with the calm, ordinary Sunday the day had otherwise been. Within minutes, that roar would be joined by a sound few of them had ever heard before, and none of them had a name for, the sound of a fire large enough to generate its own wind, moving through a town built, board by board, sidewalk by sidewalk, roof by roof, from the same material now feeding it. What happened in the hours that followed would leave a death toll that no single agency was ever able to fix with precision, in a town whose own records did not survive the night to help anyone try. That count and the reasons behind its uncertainty belong to later in this account. What matters in this moment is only what was true as the roar grew louder over Peshtigo on the night of October 8th, a town built entirely of the material now catching fire around it. A wind strong enough to carry that fire ahead of itself by more than a mile, and a population with no framework, no warning, and no precedent for understanding what was about to happen to the streets, the mill, and the river that had built their lives. What arrived at Peshtigo in the final hours of October 8th, 1871, did not behave like a fire in any sense the town's residents would have recognized from experience. Survivors who lived through the night would later struggle to describe it as a single advancing wall of flame, because in most accounts it was not advancing from one direction, so much as arriving from all of them at once. Wind-driven embers had already been landing on roofs and in yards for several minutes before the main fire front reached the town's edge, meaning that by the time the largest flames appeared, dozens of separate fires were already burning inside Peshtigo itself. The wind carrying that fire has since been estimated, through reconstruction of the physical damage left behind, at speeds approaching those of a hurricane, gusting well past what any structure in town had been built to withstand. Trees more than a foot in diameter were found afterward snapped off partway up their trunks, and in several locations the direction those trees had fallen was inconsistent with a single straight-line wind, evidence that later analysts would point to as a sign of localized tornadic rotation within the fire itself. This kind of rotation forms when intense, concentrated heat rises fast enough to create a low-pressure column at its center, drawing surrounding air inward and upward in a spinning motion similar in mechanism, though not in scale or duration, to the rotation inside a conventional tornado. Unlike a tornado formed from a thunderstorm, a fire-generated vortex draws its energy directly from the combustion beneath it, meaning it can persist and intensify for as long as fuel remains available to burn. Where this rotation touched down within Peshtigo, its effects went beyond simply spreading flame. Debris caught in the vortex could be lifted, spun, and thrown with enough force to strip bark from standing trees and drive splinters of wood into surfaces with an intensity closer to a physical impact than an ordinary fire's usual mode of destruction. Residents who survived described phenomena consistent with this kind of localized rotation, without having any vocabulary to name it as such. Flames that seemed to move sideways rather than simply upward, sudden reversals in the direction embers were blowing, and moments in which the fire appeared to pulse or surge with an intensity that had no obvious relationship to the wind they could otherwise feel on their own skin. A fire generating its own rotating wind does not simply pass through a town the way a grass fire crosses a field. It can lift and carry burning material, shingles, boards, entire sections of roof, for considerable distances, scattering new points of ignition ahead of and around whatever structure the wind happened to strike. The sound preceded the sight of it for most residents. Survivors consistently described a roar loud enough to drown out human voices at close range, a noise several later compared to the passage of a freight train, though none of them had a frame of reference broad enough to capture what they were actually hearing. Heat arrived before flame did as well. In many accounts, a wave of scorching air moving ahead of the visible fire front and making breathing difficult even for residents who had not yet seen a single flame near their own homes. That heat alone was enough to ignite curtains, dry wood siding, and stacked firewood in yards across town, before the main fire had fully arrived at any given street. Panic under these conditions did not resemble the orderly evacuations residents might have imagined, if they had imagined a fire at all. Families were separated in darkness thick with smoke. Streets that had been familiar for years became disorienting within minutes, and decisions about where to run were made with seconds available, rather than the minutes a slower-moving fire might have allowed. Inside Peshtigo, the effect of this arrival was near total and nearly simultaneous. Buildings that stood several blocks apart, with no direct line of fire between them, were reported burning within minutes of one another, a pattern that made any organized firefighting response effectively impossible from the opening moments of the disaster. The mill itself, the structure around which the entire town had been organized for more than a decade, was among the first buildings consumed once ignition reached the center of town. Its yards, stacked with raw logs and finished lumber awaiting shipment, and its interior, thick with sawdust and wood shavings accumulated from years of continuous operation, offered almost no resistance to a fire already burning at an intensity beyond anything the building's construction had ever been expected to face. The bucket brigade that represented Peshtigo's only organized firefighting capacity had no meaningful role to play once the fire arrived in this form. A handful of men with buckets and hand pumps, effective against a single contained blaze in ordinary circumstances, could do nothing against a fire igniting dozens of structures within the same few minutes across an area far larger than any brigade could physically cover. What organized response existed in the earliest moments of the fire dissolved almost immediately into individual survival, as the people who might otherwise have fought the fire found themselves instead fighting simply to reach safety before the flames reached them. This collapse of any coordinated response was not a failure of courage or organization on the part of Peshtigo's residents. It reflected the plain physical reality that no firefighting method available in 1871, or for that matter available in most places today, could meaningfully contest a fire moving and igniting at the speed and scale this one had reached. The Peshtigo House, the town's principal hotel, became the site of the single largest loss of life recorded anywhere in the town that night. As the fire closed in, roughly 200 people crowded inside the building, seeking the shelter that any substantial structure would ordinarily have offered against a lesser fire. That instinct, reasonable under nearly any other circumstance, proved fatal within the Peshtigo house, specifically because the building itself was made of the same dry pine as everything else in town. Nearly everyone who sought refuge inside it that night did not survive, making the hotel the single deadliest location in a town where death that night was not concentrated in any one place so much as distributed across nearly every street. The hotel's location, near the center of town and close to the mill, had made it a natural gathering point in ordinary times, a place residents passed daily and knew as well as any building in Peshtigo. That same familiarity likely drew people toward it in the first confused minutes of the fire, when a known, solid structure would have seemed a more reasonable choice than an unfamiliar street corner or an open field. What no resident sheltering inside the Peshtigo house could have judged, in the time available to them, was that a wood frame hotel offered no meaningful advantage over any other wooden building, once ignition sources were landing on every structure in town within the same few minutes. The building's size, which might have suggested safety in an ordinary fire, meant only that a larger number of people were gathered in one place when it too caught fire. By the time anyone inside recognized the danger, the building's own exits had in many cases already become impassable, blocked by flame or by the crush of people attempting to reach the same narrow doorways at once. The concentration of loss at a single address, rather than spread evenly across the town's population, reflects this dynamic as much as it reflects the fire's overall intensity. A single structure, however large, could not accommodate an emergency evacuation of the number of people who had gathered inside it. Other residents made a different calculation, one grounded in an older and more reliable instinct. Fire cannot burn what is already underwater. The Peshtigo River, running through the center of town, became the destination for a significant portion of the population as the fire closed in from multiple directions simultaneously. Hundreds of people entered the river that night, some wading only to their knees near the banks, and others swimming to the deeper channel near the middle. In a crowd large enough that later accounts describe people packed shoulder to shoulder in the water for a considerable stretch of the riverbank. For many of them, the river did what they had hoped it would do, holding back the flames long enough for the worst of the fire to pass over the town. Some families reached the river together and stayed together through the night, standing in water that reflected the burning town on both banks back at them, unable to see how far the fire extended in any direction beyond the immediate glow. Others became separated in the crowd or in the earlier chaos of fleeing their homes, entering the water alone or with only some of the people they had started the evening with. An unnamed mill worker's family, the kind of household the surviving record can describe only in general terms rather than by name, would have faced the same choice made by hundreds of their neighbors that night. Leave a burning or threatened house, run toward the one place fire could not reach, and hope that everyone who started the run together arrived at the water together as well. For many families in Peshtigo, that hope was not rewarded. The crowd in the water grew dense enough, in the accounts that survive, that simply keeping one's footing against the current and against other panicked bodies became its own danger, separate from the fire raging on either bank. Children were held above the waterline by parents standing in water up to their own shoulders or necks, in a scene that continued for hours before the fire's intensity finally began to ease enough to risk moving back toward shore. The river was not, however, a place of guaranteed safety. The same wind driving the fire also drove burning debris out over the water itself, and floating embers landing on exposed hair, clothing, and skin injured a number of people who had otherwise done everything right by entering the water at all. Livestock, driven by the same instinct that sent people toward the water, crowded into the river alongside them in several accounts, adding to the chaos and the physical danger of the crowded channel. Horses, cattle, and other animals, panicked by heat and noise beyond anything they had experienced, moved through the water with no regard for the people standing near them, and more than one survivor account describes the added danger of simply staying upright and unharmed in a river shared with terrified livestock. Dogs that had followed their owners from burning homes were reported swimming in circles near the riverbank throughout the night, unable to find solid ground that was not itself on fire, a detail that appears in more than one survivor's later account of the confusion along the water's edge. Others drowned, a consequence less of the fire directly than of panic, cold, and the sheer number of people crowded into a single stretch of river in complete darkness, with a firestorm roaring on both banks. Some who could not swim well, or who were pulled under by others struggling beside them, did not survive a night that, for those on the riverbank, had become as much a fight against drowning as against flame. The heat itself was, in places, intense enough to raise the temperature of the water people were standing in, a detail confirmed by survivor accounts describing the river as noticeably warm even in the deeper channel, far from any burning structure on shore. Some accounts describe people repeatedly submerging their heads to keep hair and clothing from igniting, even while their bodies remained in water meant to protect them. A firestorm of the scale that struck Peshtigo also consumes the oxygen in its immediate vicinity at a rate that ordinary fires do not approach, drawing air inward toward its base with enough force to make breathing difficult even for people who had reached apparent safety in the river. Several survivor accounts describe a sensation of suffocation distinct from smoke inhalation, consistent with what modern fire science would later identify as oxygen displacement near the base of a large, wind-fed firestorm. For people standing chest-deep in the Peshtigo River, this meant that survival depended on more than simply avoiding direct flame. It depended on finding air to breathe at all, in a night when the fire itself was actively competing with every living creature nearby for the oxygen in the surrounding air. Not every resident who sought shelter in water survived the choice. In one documented case, 3 people took refuge inside a water tank, a raised wooden cistern of the kind used by several structures in town for fire suppression and general water storage, believing the tank's contents would shield them from the flames outside its walls. The surrounding fire proved hot enough to heat the water inside the tank itself, and all 3 people inside were killed, not by flame directly, but by water that had, in effect, been brought to a boil around them. It stands as one of the starkest illustrations of how completely the fire had overwhelmed every ordinary form of shelter a resident of Peshtigo might reasonably have chosen that night. The same logic that made a hotel seem safer than a wooden house, or a water tank seem safer than open air, failed everywhere in Peshtigo that night for the same underlying reason. No structure, no body of water, and no ordinary precaution had been designed with a firestorm of this scale in mind, because nothing resembling it had occurred in living memory anywhere in the region. Every choice made that night, whether toward the hotel, toward the river, or toward the water tank, represented a reasonable judgment based on decades of experience with ordinary fire. What made October 8th different was not that residents chose poorly. It was that the fire itself had exceeded every category of danger their experience had prepared them to recognize. Throughout the town, the fire's passage was, by most accounts, extraordinarily fast. Survivors consistently described the worst of the destruction as complete within roughly an hour of the fire's arrival, a time frame almost impossible to reconcile with the scale of what had been lost, until the underlying mechanics of a wind-driven firestorm are taken into account. An ordinary structure fire might take hours to fully consume a single large building. A firestorm carrying hurricane-force wind and igniting dozens of structures simultaneously, each one built of the same dry, resin-rich pine, does not follow that timeline. It is not one fire working through one building at a time. It is dozens of fires, then hundreds, converging and reinforcing each other within minutes of first contact. By the time the wind began to ease in the very early hours of October 9th, the physical town of Peshtigo, the mill, the company store, the boarding houses, the hotel, the wood-plank sidewalks that had carried foot traffic every ordinary evening for years, had largely ceased to exist as a built environment. What remained standing, in most accounts, could be counted rather than described in general terms, a handful of structures spared by the particular path the wind's rotation had carried the flames around rather than through. Everything else, homes, shops, the mill that had given the town its reason for existing in the first place, was gone. Dawn on October 9th revealed a landscape that bore almost no resemblance to the town that had existed 12 hours earlier. Where streets had run between rows of wood frame houses, survivors found open ground, still smoking, marked here and there by the stone chimneys and iron fittings that were the only parts of most structures able to survive fire at that intensity. The ground itself had changed in places, with topsoil scorched away and exposed to a depth that later observers found unusual even for a severe forest fire. In some areas near the heart of town, almost nothing organic remained above ground level, a degree of destruction consistent with the extreme, sustained temperatures a self-sustaining firestorm can produce. Metal objects that would ordinarily have survived any conventional house fire intact were found melted or warped in ways that surprised even observers who arrived expecting severe damage. Iron stove fittings, tools, and hardware recovered from the wreckage in the days after the fire showed deformation consistent with temperatures well beyond what an ordinary structure fire generates. Further evidence of just how far outside normal experience the events of that night had fallen. Survivors emerging from the river in the hours after the worst of the fire passed found a town that offered almost nothing in the way of immediate shelter, food, or clean water, since the same fire that had destroyed their homes had also destroyed the mill, the company store, and every other source of supply the town depended on. Many spent the remaining hours of darkness still standing in or near the water, uncertain whether the fire might return with a shift in wind before daylight finally made clear how completely the danger had passed. Those who had survived the night, whether in the river, in scattered clearings that the fire had somehow passed over, or in the handful of structures left standing, emerged before dawn into a landscape few of them could immediately recognize as the town they had gone to sleep in less than 12 hours earlier. The scale of loss became apparent only gradually as survivors began searching for family members, neighbors, and co-workers among the small groups gathered in the open ground where the town had stood. For some families, that search ended quickly, with relatives found alive among the crowd still standing near the riverbank. For others, it did not end quickly at all, and for a significant number, it would not end with anyone found alive. The full scope of how many people had not survived the night would take considerably longer to establish than the fire itself had taken to burn through the town, a fact tied directly to the same destruction that had made the disaster so complete in the first place. Survivors moved through the wreckage of streets they had known for years, calling out names into a landscape that no longer offered the landmarks, a particular house, a particular fence line, a familiar stretch of sidewalk that would ordinarily have helped them orient themselves or locate a specific address. In several accounts, people found themselves unable to identify exactly where their own home had stood, the surrounding markers so completely erased that one stretch of scorched ground looked much like any other. The physical injuries among survivors ranged widely, from burns suffered while fleeing through falling embers to the effects of prolonged exposure in cold river water through a long autumn night. Many of those who had stood in the Peshtigo River for hours emerged with injuries from cold and exhaustion layered on top of whatever burns or smoke exposure they had already suffered before reaching the water, a combination that would complicate recovery efforts for survivors in the days that followed. The fire that had done this to Peshtigo did not stop at the town's boundary. Driven by the same wind, feeding on the same drought-dried forest that had made the disaster possible in the first place, it continued moving outward in multiple directions at once, carrying the same danger toward communities that had received no more warning than Peshtigo itself had. The same wind that had destroyed Peshtigo did not confine its damage to a single town. Driven by the identical conditions of drought, accumulated forest debris, and hurricane-force wind, the fire moved simultaneously through a wider area, stretching across much of Wisconsin's Door Peninsula and along the shoreline communities of Green Bay. This was not a single fire radiating outward from one point of origin, in the way a match dropped in dry grass might spread in a widening circle. It was, more accurately, a regional firestorm condition, the same atmospheric collision of drought, wind, and accumulated fuel, producing near-simultaneous catastrophic fire behavior across dozens of separate communities that had no direct connection to one another beyond sharing the same forest, the same weather, and the same vulnerable pattern of settlement. Each of these communities experienced the fire as its own singular catastrophe, with no way of knowing, in the hours immediately following, that neighboring towns and settlements were enduring an identical ordeal at the same moment. Communication between these scattered communities depended entirely on survivors traveling by foot, by boat, or eventually by whatever telegraph lines remained intact, meaning that the full scope of the regional disaster would take days to become clear, even to the people who had lived through it. On the Door Peninsula, a narrow strip of land extending northeast between Green Bay and Lake Michigan, a small settlement called Williamsonville experienced destruction on a scale disproportionate to its size. Somewhere between 50 and 60 residents died there that night, out of a community whose total population had been small enough that this single event accounted for a significant share of everyone who lived in the settlement. The pattern of destruction across the wider region followed the same underlying logic in every location it reached. Wherever accumulated logging debris, drought-dried undergrowth, and wood frame construction coincided with the arrival of the wind-driven firestorm, catastrophic loss followed within a similarly narrow window of time. The fire did not discriminate between a substantial town like Peshtigo and a settlement as small as Williamsonville, because the physical conditions that made both places vulnerable were, in every relevant respect, identical. What differed from place to place was not the fire's intensity, but the specific geography each community could draw on for shelter, and the amount of warning, however minimal, that residents in each location happened to receive before the fire's leading edge arrived. Communities near a substantial body of water, like Peshtigo on its river, or Marinette and Menominee on Green Bay itself, generally fared better in terms of survival than smaller, more isolated settlements without a comparable refuge nearby. Williamsonville had no river of comparable size to the one that had sheltered so many people in Peshtigo, and its residents were forced to improvise other forms of shelter against a fire arriving with the same speed and intensity. Survivors in the area later described taking refuge in a recently plowed field where the absence of standing vegetation offered at least some protection against a fire that fed primarily on trees, brush, and wooden structures. That field, cleared for planting only weeks or months before the fire arrived, became one of the few places in the immediate area where a group of residents survived largely intact, an outcome owed as much to the accident of recent agricultural clearing as to any deliberate fire safety consideration. Elsewhere on the peninsula, without comparable open ground nearby, the death toll among residents caught without adequate shelter climbed accordingly. The Williamsonville losses fell disproportionately on families who had settled the area only recently, drawn by the same cutover land and available farmland that had attracted settlers to the sugar bush communities further south. Many of the dead were children, a pattern repeated across several of the smaller settlements struck that night, where families caught in the open with young children faced a physical challenge that adults alone might have survived: the impossibility of moving quickly enough, carrying small children, to reach whatever shelter existed before the fire's leading edge arrived. Survivors who reached the plowed field near Williamsonville described conditions similar to those endured by residents standing in the Peshtigo River: intense heat, thick smoke, and a wait of uncertain duration before it was safe to move again, made bearable only by the field's freedom from the burning vegetation that surrounded it on every side. Unlike the river, the field offered no water to help manage the heat directly, meaning survivors there endured the fire's most intense phase with considerably less protection than those who had reached deeper water elsewhere in the region. Further inland from the coast, a cluster of small farming settlements, known collectively as the sugar bush communities, faced conditions nearly identical to those in Peshtigo and Williamsonville. These settlements had been established by families who took up small landholdings once the pine forest around them had already been logged, clearing the cutover land for agriculture in the years leading up to 1871. The same accumulated slash that had made Peshtigo's surrounding forests so dangerous existed in comparable quantities around the sugar bush farms, left behind by the same logging operations that had supplied lumber to Peshtigo's mill in the preceding decade. When the fire reached these settlements, it found conditions no different from those that had destroyed the larger town nearby, and the results, in terms of loss of life and property, followed a similarly devastating pattern. Farming families in the sugar bush area, more isolated than residents of a town like Peshtigo, and with fewer neighbors nearby to assist in an emergency, faced the fire largely on their own, without the crowd of hundreds that had given Peshtigo's river refuge whatever collective advantage it offered. Some families survived by reaching wells, root cellars, or recently cleared fields similar to the one that had sheltered survivors in Williamsonville, while others, caught in the open with no comparable refuge nearby, did not. The scattered settlement pattern of the sugar bush communities, with individual farmsteads spread across cutover land rather than clustered in a town center, meant that news of the approaching fire, where it traveled at all, moved slowly and unevenly between neighbors. A family on one farm might see and smell the smoke minutes or even an hour before a neighbor a mile away noticed anything unusual, with no reliable way to pass along a warning faster than a person could physically travel between the two properties. This isolation, ordinarily an accepted feature of rural farm life in the region, became a decisive disadvantage once the fire arrived with the speed it demonstrated that night. Residents in Peshtigo, whatever the scale of their own losses, had at least the advantage of a concentrated population able to share information, however imperfectly, about where the fire was and where shelter might be found. Farm families scattered across the sugar bush had no equivalent resource, and made their decisions about where to run based on whatever they alone could see and hear from their own property. To the north and west of Peshtigo, the twin communities of Marinette and Menominee sat where the Menominee River flowed into Green Bay, built on a lumber economy nearly identical to Peshtigo's own. Both towns faced the same fire that same night, though the specific circumstances of their exposure differed enough from Peshtigo's to produce a different, though still severe, outcome. As the fire approached, a significant number of residents in the Marinette and Menominee area sought escape by water, a choice made easier by the town's location directly on Green Bay itself rather than on an inland river. Among the vessels involved in the escape that night was a steamer named the Union, which carried roughly 300 passengers, most of them women and children, away from the immediate danger along the shoreline. The decision to load the Union with passengers and attempt an escape by water was made under conditions offering little time for deliberation, as the fire's approach along the shoreline gave crews and residents only a narrow window in which to gather passengers and depart before the route itself became impassable. Men who might otherwise have accompanied their families chose, in a number of documented cases, to remain behind to fight the fire-threatening remaining structures or to assist others still making their way toward the harbor, a decision that left the vessel's passenger manifest weighted heavily toward women, children, and the elderly. The Union's escape required passing through a channel where flames from burning shoreline structures and adjacent forest came close enough to the water to put the vessel and everyone aboard it at direct risk during the crossing. The steamer's officers, tasked with navigating a loaded passenger vessel through smoke, darkness, and a corridor of active fire on both sides, succeeded in bringing the ship and its passengers through to safety, an outcome that depended on judgment and seamanship under conditions few captains anywhere had ever been required to navigate. No formal manual or established protocol existed in 1871 for evacuating a lumber town's population by steamer through an active shoreline fire, meaning every decision made aboard the Union that night was, by necessity, improvised in response to conditions no captain's training had anticipated. Passengers aboard the Union later described a crossing made almost entirely by instinct and by whatever visibility the burning shoreline itself provided, since normal navigation aids offered little help in conditions where smoke obscured the horizon and burning debris occasionally fell within sight of the deck. The heat radiating from the shoreline fires was reportedly intense enough to be felt clearly by passengers standing on open deck, even at a distance that should ordinarily have offered some insulation from a fire on land. That several hundred people reached safety aboard a single vessel that night stands as one of the more fortunate outcomes among the many communities struck by the fire, though it should not obscure the losses that Marinette, Menominee, and the smaller settlements around them still suffered in the buildings, farms, and lives claimed before anyone reached the relative safety of open water. For the families aboard the Union, safety came at the cost of an uncertain wait once the vessel had cleared the worst of the fire along the shoreline, since with communications disrupted and much of the surrounding region in the same chaos, there was no reliable way to learn quickly whether husbands, fathers, and other relatives who had remained behind had survived the night. That uncertainty, for some families, would not resolve for days, and for others, it would resolve into confirmation of exactly the loss they had feared when the ship first pulled away from the burning shore. The vessel itself became, in the days immediately following the fire, one of several improvised centers for gathering and caring for survivors along the Green Bay shoreline. Its capacity to hold and transport large numbers of people, making it useful for relief efforts even after its role in the initial escape had ended. Passengers who had fled aboard it in the chaos of October 8th found themselves, within days, assisting in the broader effort to account for the missing and to distribute what limited food and supplies remained available in a region where nearly every store of goods had burned along with everything else. Much of what is known today about the fire's passage through this wider region, beyond the physical evidence and the fragmentary newspaper accounts assembled in the weeks afterward, comes from a single detailed written record left by a survivor with both the literacy and the inclination to set down what he had witnessed. Reverend Peter Pernin, a Catholic priest serving communities in and around the affected area, survived the fire and published a first-hand account of the disaster in 1874, 3 years after the events themselves. His narrative remains, to this day, the most complete surviving description of what the fire looked and felt like from the perspective of someone who lived through it directly, rather than reconstructing it afterward from second-hand reports. Pernin's position as a parish priest gave him both the pastoral responsibility to attend to his congregation during the disaster and, in its aftermath, a natural role as someone parishioners and neighboring communities turned to for an account of what had happened. His decision to set that account down formally in writing, rather than leaving it to fade into the kind of scattered oral memory that most disasters of the period relied on, distinguished his contribution from nearly every other surviving record of the fire. In the weeks after the fire, Pernin's parish, like nearly every institution across the affected region, faced the immediate practical challenge of ministering to a community that had lost not only homes and possessions, but, in many cases, every family member who might otherwise have provided support through the disaster's aftermath. Church buildings themselves had burned alongside everything else in most of the affected settlements, leaving clergy across the region to conduct services, register the dead, and organize relief in whatever open spaces or salvaged structures remained. This context matters for understanding why Pernin's written account carries the weight it does among surviving records of the fire. He was not an outside observer arriving after the fact to document a disaster from a comfortable distance, but a participant who had lost his own church and much of his own community in the same hours he later chose to describe in careful, sustained detail. Pernin's account describes his own experience of seeking refuge in a river during the fire's passage, a decision that mirrored the choice made by hundreds of Peshtigo residents on the same night, though his specific location placed him among a different group of survivors making the same essential calculation under the same essential threat. His writing captures details that official reports and newspaper summaries of the period generally did not attempt to record: the specific sounds of the approaching fire, the behavior of people around him under extreme duress, and the physical sensations of surviving in water while a firestorm burned on every side. Because Pernin wrote with the training and vocabulary of an educated clergyman, rather than the abbreviated style of a newspaper correspondent working against a deadline, his account preserves a level of interior detail rare among disaster narratives of the period. He described not only what he saw and heard, but the sequence of decisions he made under pressure, offering later readers a rare window into the actual reasoning process of someone navigating a catastrophe in real time, rather than a summary assembled afterward from multiple second-hand sources. The value of Pernin's account to later historians lies precisely in this level of direct, sustained detail from someone with the education and the motivation to write it down carefully. In a disaster whose other survivors were, for the most part, occupied in the immediate aftermath with the more urgent business of finding food, shelter, and missing family members, rather than composing a written record for future readers. Without Pernin's narrative, much of what is now understood about the specific, lived experience of the fire across this wider region would rest almost entirely on brief newspaper items, official damage assessments, and the kind of general demographic estimates that can describe how many people died without conveying anything about what those final hours had actually been like for the people living through them. Later historians researching the fire have relied on Pernin's account not only for its narrative detail, but for the way it corroborates and contextualizes the physical evidence found across the region. The pattern of tree damage consistent with rotational wind, the extreme heat suggested by warped metal and scorched ground, the speed of the fire's passage implied by how little time separated a normal Sunday evening from total destruction. A written account from someone who experienced these conditions directly gives later researchers a way to connect the physical evidence to actual human experience, rather than treating the disaster as a purely statistical or geological event. Pernin's decision to publish his account 3 years after the fire, rather than immediately in its aftermath, likely reflected both the practical demands of rebuilding a parish and community in the disaster's wake, and the time required to process and set down an experience of that magnitude, with the level of detail his final narrative achieved. Immediate accounts, written in the days after a disaster of this scale, often prioritize basic facts: who survived, who did not, what remains standing, over the kind of sustained, reflective detail that makes a document valuable to readers and researchers generations later. The 3-year gap also allowed Pernin the benefit of some distance from the events themselves, time enough to organize scattered memories of a single chaotic night into the kind of coherent, sequential narrative that a reader could follow from beginning to end, without the immediacy overwhelming the account's clarity. Across this entire stretch of northeastern Wisconsin, from the ruins of Peshtigo through Williamsonville, the sugar bush settlements, and the shoreline communities of Marinette and Menominee, the fire had, within a single night, destroyed a regional economy built over more than 2 decades and killed a number of people that no single official count would ever manage to fix with precision. The geographic reach of the destruction that night extended across an area historians would later estimate at well over 1 million acres, a figure that becomes easier to grasp when set against the scale of an individual farm or town lot, rather than left as an abstract number. Within that footprint sat not one town, but a dozen or more distinct communities, each with its own church, its own school, its own small cluster of stores and homes, all reduced within the same several hours to the same condition of ash and standing chimneys that had come to define Peshtigo's own morning after. That imprecision was not a failure of the people attempting to count the dead in the weeks that followed. It was a direct consequence of how completely the fire itself had erased the ordinary infrastructure, town records, church registries, personal identification, in some cases entire families, with no survivor left to report them missing, that any accurate count would have depended on. A town like Peshtigo had, before October 8th, kept the kinds of records any 19th century American community relied on to establish who lived where: company payroll ledgers, church membership rolls, a general store's account books tracking who owed what against future wages. Nearly all of this documentation existed on paper, stored in the same wood frame buildings that burned along with everything else in town, meaning that the single most reliable source for confirming who had been present in Peshtigo on the night of the fire vanished in the same hours as the people themselves. The disaster's geographic breadth compounded this problem in a further way. Because the fire had struck more than a dozen separate settlements simultaneously, each with its own local leadership, its own church, and its own informal system for tracking residents, no single authority existed anywhere in the region capable of consolidating a count across the full affected area in the days immediately following the fire. A survivor searching for a missing relative in Williamsonville had no practical way of learning whether that same relative had, in fact, been visiting Peshtigo or the sugar bush settlements on the night of the fire, since travel and communication across the region remained severely limited for days after the disaster. This fragmentation meant that early counts, however carefully compiled within any single settlement, could not by themselves capture the true regional scope of the loss, a gap that would only be partially closed by the more systematic accounting efforts undertaken in the months and years that followed. In the days following October 8, 1871, no single number could capture how many people the fire across northeastern Wisconsin had actually killed. Officials attempting to establish even a preliminary count faced a problem unlike anything a conventional disaster of the period would have presented. A building collapse, a shipwreck, or an ordinary structure fire typically left behind some combination of survivors, witnesses, and physical remains sufficient to establish a reasonably accurate count within days or weeks. The fire that struck Peshtigo and the surrounding region left behind none of these things in the quantities investigators needed. Entire households had, in a number of documented cases, been destroyed together, leaving no survivor to report their absence and no neighbor close enough, given the region's scattered settlement pattern, to notice that a particular family had gone missing. The most immediate obstacle was the fire itself. In many locations, the heat had been intense enough to leave nothing recoverable behind. No remains substantial enough for a search party to find, identify, or even count as a confirmed death rather than a presumed one. A formal report, compiled 2 years later, in 1873, attempted to bring some order to the uncertainty by listing the names of those known to have died or disappeared in the disaster. That report identified 1,182 individuals by name, a figure that represented the most rigorous accounting available at the time, and one that researchers would continue to treat as a meaningful floor for the death toll for more than a century afterward. Compiling even this partial list required investigators to cross-reference whatever fragments of documentation had survived the fire against the recollections of survivors scattered across the affected region, a slow and difficult process given how few records had escaped the fire intact. Investigators worked from surviving church registers in nearby unaffected parishes, testimony gathered from displaced residents relocated to Green Bay and other surrounding communities, and whatever partial payroll and boarding house records happened to have been stored outside the immediate fire zone at the time of the disaster. Even that carefully compiled list, researchers now generally agree, undercounted the true toll. Estimates for the death toll within the village of Peshtigo itself range from 500 to 800 people, while the total across the entire path of the fire, including Williamsonville, the sugar bush settlements, and the smaller communities scattered across the region, climbs to a range most commonly cited as between 1,200 and 2,500. This wide range persists in modern historical accounts, not because researchers disagree about how to count the dead, but because the underlying evidence itself supports no single precise figure. Later researchers working with the surviving fragments of the 1873 report church records that happen to survive in nearby communities and comparisons against pre-fire population estimates for the affected settlements have each arrived at somewhat different totals, none of which can claim definitive accuracy, given how much of the original evidence the fire itself destroyed. That range of more than 1,000 people, wide enough to represent genuine uncertainty rather than simple rounding, exists because of specific, identifiable gaps in the underlying record, not because anyone counting the dead was careless or indifferent to precision. The logging industry that had built Peshtigo and the surrounding settlements depended heavily on a transient workforce, men who moved between logging camps, mills, and construction sites as seasonal work demanded, often without family nearby and without registering with any local government office that might otherwise have tracked their presence. An unknown number of these workers were almost certainly killed in the fire, without any family member positioned to report them missing, and without any employer keeping the kind of detailed personnel records that might have flagged their absence afterward. The region's immigrant population compounded this problem in a specific way. Many recent arrivals from Scandinavia, Germany, and other parts of Europe had settled in the area only within the preceding few years, in some cases without extended family anywhere in the country who might notice, months or years later, that letters home had stopped arriving. For families still living in Norway, Sweden, or the German states, a son or daughter who had emigrated to a Wisconsin lumber camp represented, in practical terms, someone whose fate could only be confirmed through correspondence that might already have been irregular before the fire, given the distances and postal delays involved in 19th century transatlantic communication. A gap of several months without a letter, unusual but not alarming under ordinary circumstances, gave no clear signal that anything catastrophic had occurred, let alone that the person in question might already be among the dead. This meant that a meaningful share of the fire's victims were, in effect, invisible to any counting method that depended on someone actively reporting a person as missing. They existed in the historical record only insofar as company payroll ledgers, boarding house registers, or similar documents had recorded their presence before the fire destroyed those same records, along with the buildings that housed them. A mass grave established in the town cemetery in the weeks after the fire held the remains of roughly 350 people, whose bodies could not be identified, either because burns had destroyed the physical features needed for recognitions, or because no survivor remained who had known them well enough to confirm who they were. That single grave, more than any other piece of physical evidence from the disaster, illustrates the specific mechanism behind the uncertainty in the overall death toll. Not a failure to search, but a fire thorough enough to erase the very information any accurate count would have required. Burial itself, in the days immediately following the fire, presented practical difficulties that further complicated any effort at careful individual identification, with the town's own infrastructure destroyed and survivors focused on immediate necessities of food, shelter, and medical care for the injured. The priority for recovered remains quickly became respectful burial, rather than the kind of careful, methodical identification process that might have reduced the number of unnamed dead in the mass grave. Volunteers and surviving residents worked through the following days and weeks to recover and bury remains found across the ruined town, and surrounding countryside, a task complicated by both the scale of destruction and the physical toll the search itself took on searchers already exhausted from surviving the fire and the days that followed it. The 350 unidentified dead represent, in this sense, not a research failure but the practical limit of what any community, however diligent, could accomplish under those specific circumstances. The fire's effect on communication infrastructure created a second, separate obstacle. This one delaying not the count of the dead, but the arrival of any outside help at all. Telegraph technology in 1871 was still a relatively young infrastructure across rural America, with lines typically following the same transportation corridors, rail lines, and major roads that connected towns to the wider commercial economy. Peshtigo's connection to this network ran through a single line, adequate for the town's ordinary commercial needs but offering no redundancy whatsoever in the event that the line itself became unusable. The telegraph lines connecting Peshtigo and the surrounding settlements to the rest of Wisconsin ran through the same wooden poles and wire that a fire of this scale destroyed as thoroughly as it destroyed every building in town. The nearest telegraph office, still functioning after the fire, sat in Green Bay, roughly 45 miles away, meaning that any message requesting help had to travel that distance by some means other than the instant communication residents might otherwise have relied on. In practice, this meant messengers on foot or on horseback, carrying word of the disaster along roads that were themselves often obstructed by fallen trees, scorched ground, and the general disorder a firestorm of this scale leaves in its wake. Every hour that passed between the fire's end and the moment a rider reached a working telegraph line represented an hour in which survivors, already without food, shelter, or clean water, had no way of signaling their situation to anyone beyond the immediate region. The messengers who eventually carried word to Green Bay and beyond were, in most cases, ordinary residents of the fire zone, rather than any official government or company representative, since the disaster had struck too suddenly and too completely for any organized reporting system to have been in place beforehand. Their journey, undertaken on foot or horseback through terrain still smoldering in places, represented the only mechanism by which the outside world could learn what had happened, a single point of failure that, had any of these messengers been unable to complete the trip, would have delayed outside knowledge of the disaster even further. News of the disaster's true scale did not reach the state government in Madison until 2 full days after the fire itself, a delay that meant the first organized relief efforts did not begin moving north until survivors had already spent 2 nights fending for themselves in a landscape stripped of nearly every resource a community depends on. The person who ultimately set that relief effort in motion was not, as circumstance would have it, the governor of Wisconsin himself. Lucius Fairchild, Wisconsin's governor in 1871, was in Chicago on the day the fire reached Peshtigo, having traveled south with a shipment of relief supplies for the victims of the fire burning through that city on the very same night. When word of the disaster in his own state finally reached Madison, it was Fairchild's wife, Frances Bull Fairchild, 24 years old at the time, who received it and who made the decisions that determined how quickly organized help would reach the survivors. Frances Fairchild had no formal government role of her own, and nothing in her position as the governor's wife obligated her to act in his absence. What the surviving record shows is that she did act, quickly and with a degree of practical decisiveness that the more established channels of state government, still unaware of the disaster's scale, had not yet begun to demonstrate. This willingness to act without waiting for formal authorization proved decisive in the specific window of time it covered. Every hour spent waiting for the governor to be located, informed, and to issue his own instructions from Chicago would have been an hour survivors near Peshtigo spent without the blankets, food, and medical supplies that the diverted boxcar and the Madison collection effort eventually provided. Francis Fairchild ordered a boxcar of supplies already loaded and bound for Chicago to be redirected north toward the fire zone in Wisconsin instead, a decision made without any formal authority to issue it, since she held no official government position beyond her marriage to the governor. She followed that decision by organizing a public collection of blankets and clothing across Madison, gathering additional relief material that would otherwise have taken considerably longer to assemble through official government channels alone. The railroad company handling the diverted boxcar granted the relief shipment priority over other scheduled traffic once informed of its purpose, a small operational decision that, multiplied across the following days and weeks, meaningfully shortened the gap between the disaster and the arrival of usable supplies in the affected region. Lucius Fairchild himself, once informed of what had happened in his own state, redirected his attention from Chicago and issued a formal appeal for aid, which brought additional donations and supplies from communities across the country in the weeks that followed. This sequence of decisions, made by someone acting entirely outside her formal authority because the person who did hold that authority was 250 miles away, helping a different city, illustrates something specific about how thoroughly the fire in Chicago had already captured the attention of officials, relief organizations, and ordinary citizens across the region before most of them had even learned that a second, larger disaster had occurred at the same time. That imbalance in attention did not correct itself once the facts became known. In the weeks and months that followed, newspapers across the country devoted vastly more coverage to the fire in Chicago than to the fire in Wisconsin, despite the clear disparity in loss of life between the two events. Several structural factors explain this gap, none of them related to which disaster caused greater human suffering. Chicago was already the kind of city a national newspaper network was built to cover quickly, home to established wire service connections, resident correspondence, and telegraph infrastructure that could move a story to readers in New York or Boston within hours of the fire's first reports. A major newspaper covering the Chicago fire could rely on reporters already stationed in the city, familiar with its streets, its institutions, and its notable residents, capable of filing detailed, immediate copy without the delay of traveling to an unfamiliar location first. That same newspaper, attempting to cover events in Peshtigo, would have needed to dispatch a correspondent to a remote lumber town few staff members had ever visited, reachable only after the same damaged transportation and communication infrastructure that had delayed the state government's own relief response. Peshtigo and the surrounding settlements had none of this. A remote lumber town with a largely immigrant workforce, connected to the outside world by a single telegraph line that the fire itself had destroyed, was simply not positioned to generate the kind of rapid, sustained news coverage that Chicago's fire produced almost automatically, given the city's existing prominence and infrastructure. By the time detailed accounts of the Wisconsin fires began reaching national newspapers, days after the disaster itself, the Chicago story had already established itself as the defining fire narrative of the moment, complete with named victims, identifiable landmarks, and a developing legend involving a cow and an overturned lantern that would attach itself permanently to the Chicago fire's popular memory. Peshtigo's story arrived, by comparison, as a later, less vivid addendum to a narrative the public had already begun to consider settled. The financial dimension of each disaster reinforced this disparity. Chicago's fire destroyed a major commercial and financial center, with property losses estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars and consequences serious enough to threaten the stability of several American and European insurance companies that had underwritten policies in the city. Insurance companies with exposure to Chicago's losses faced claims substantial enough to threaten their own solvency, a financial crisis that rippled outward through the broader insurance industry and drew sustained coverage from business and financial publications, with no comparable interest in a lumber town's losses. A story with the potential to bankrupt established financial institutions commanded a kind of ongoing journalistic attention that a disaster affecting mostly uninsured wooden structures and modest personal property, however devastating to the people who owned them, simply could not generate in the same way. Peshtigo's losses, while catastrophic to the people who suffered them, represented a far smaller sum in the kind of dollar terms that shaped how national newspapers and their readers judged a disaster's significance, with property damage across the entire fire zone estimated at a small fraction of what Chicago alone had lost. A national business and finance press built around tracking exactly this kind of economic disruption had every institutional reason to follow the Chicago story closely, and comparatively little reason, in the commercial logic of the period, to invest the same resources in a lumber town most of its readers had never heard of. This disparity in coverage produced a disparity in consequence that outlasted the disaster itself by decades. Chicago's fire led directly to a serious public conversation about urban building codes, fire prevention, and municipal fire departments, a conversation that produced genuine, lasting changes in how American cities regulated construction and organized fire protection in the years that followed. Chicago's rebuilding effort incorporated stricter requirements for fireproof construction materials in the city's central districts, along with expanded funding for professional firefighting equipment and personnel, changes driven in large part by the sustained public and political attention the fire had generated. These changes did not happen automatically. They happened because enough public pressure, backed by extensive press coverage and the direct economic interests of a major American city, pushed elected officials and business leaders to act. The speed of Chicago's regulatory response stood in sharp contrast to what followed in Wisconsin, where no comparable coalition of public pressure, press attention, and economic self-interest existed to push state or local government towards similar reform. No comparable conversation followed Peshtigo with anything close to the same speed or institutional weight. The specific practices that had made the disaster possible, unregulated land-clearing fires, unmanaged logging left to accumulate for years across cutover forest, wood frame construction built without any meaningful consideration of regional fire risk, continued largely unchanged across the forests of northern Wisconsin and Michigan for years after 1871, in the absence of any state or federal framework treating wildfire as a hazard requiring systematic regulation. Logging companies operating in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota continued clearing land by the same methods that had contributed to the 1871 disaster well into the following decades, since nothing in state or federal law required them to change, and no insurance industry pressure equivalent to what Chicago's underwriters had exerted on urban construction existed to push rural logging practices toward greater caution. The lesson available in Peshtigo's ashes that accumulated/drought and wood construction could combine into a catastrophe of this scale remained, for the time being, a lesson without an institutional mechanism to act on it. Individual voices did raise the alarm in the years immediately following the disaster. Early American conservationists, among them the forestry advocates Franklin Hoof and Bernhard Fernau, pointed specifically to Peshtigo in their arguments that unmanaged forests represented a genuine threat to the nation's future timber supply, using the scale of the 1871 disaster as evidence for policies that neither state nor federal government had yet been persuaded to adopt. Hoof, appointed in the 1870s to compile the first federal reports on the condition of American forests, drew directly on the Peshtigo disaster to argue that the country's approach to forest management, or rather its near-total absence of one, left both timber resources and human settlements dangerously exposed to exactly the kind of catastrophic fire that had struck Wisconsin. Fernau, who would go on to lead the federal forestry agency of the period, made similar arguments rooted in the same evidence, treating Peshtigo not as an isolated freak event, but as a demonstration of what unmanaged, unregulated forest land inevitably produced given the right combination of drought and ignition. These arguments circulated among a relatively small community of conservationists, foresters, and interested policymakers through the 1870s and 1880s, without translating into the kind of broad legislative action that would have directly addressed the conditions that had produced the Peshtigo Fire. The practical, day-to-day economics of the logging industry, built around exactly the land clearing and disposal practices that conservationists like Hoof and Fernau criticized, continued to operate with little meaningful interference from either state or federal authority through most of this period. Their arguments did not produce immediate results. It would take another set of catastrophic fires decades later and a different set of political circumstances entirely before the warnings first raised in Peshtigo's aftermath translated into anything resembling a coordinated national response to the danger the fire had demonstrated so completely. What changed, when change finally did come, was not a sudden reassessment of what Peshtigo had shown the country. It was a fresh catastrophe, closer to the centers of federal political power and striking a workforce with more direct institutional representation than Peshtigo's largely immigrant, largely rural population had commanded in 1871, that finally supplied the political momentum Hoof and Fernau's warnings alone had not been able to generate. The catastrophe that finally moved the American government to act on the warnings Peshtigo had raised decades earlier struck in August of 1910 in the forests of Idaho, Montana, and Washington. The summer of 1910 had followed a pattern uncomfortably similar to the summer of 1871, with drought conditions across the northern Rocky Mountains leaving forests dangerously dry heading into late summer. Hundreds of small fires, many started by lightning and others by human activity connected to logging and railroad construction, had been burning across the region for weeks before conditions converged to produce a catastrophe on a scale the young Forest Service had never before confronted. Over the course of roughly 2 days, wind-driven fires burned through approximately 3 million acres of forest across the northern Rocky Mountains in an event that came to be known as the Big Blow-Up. 85 people died in that fire, 72 of them professional firefighters employed by the young United States Forest Service, an agency that had been established only 5 years earlier in 1905 to manage the nation's newly designated forest reserves. The physical mechanics of the 1910 fire echoed what had happened in Wisconsin nearly 4 decades earlier in ways contemporary observers explicitly noted at the time. A wind-driven firestorm, capable of generating its own weather, moving through forest and settlement alike, faster than any organized human response could contain it, leaving death and destruction disproportionate to any single point of ignition. Survivors of the 1910 fire, including a number of the Forest Service firefighters who managed to escape, described conditions strikingly similar to those recorded in Wisconsin in 1871. Hurricane-force winds, a roar audible before any flame came into view, and a fire that seemed to move in multiple directions simultaneously, rather than advancing along a single predictable front. The parallel was not lost on the foresters, journalists, and policymakers who studied the 1910 disaster in its aftermath, several of whom drew explicit comparisons to Peshtigo in arguing for stronger federal fire policy. The Forest Service's creation in 1905 had itself grown out of the same conservation movement that Franklin Hough and Bernhard Furneaux had helped build in the years following Peshtigo, transferring responsibility for federal forest reserves from the Department of the Interior to a dedicated agency within the Department of Agriculture. Gifford Pinchot, appointed as the agency's first chief, inherited an organization with authority over millions of acres of public land, but with only a fraction of the personnel, funding, and legal tools that effective fire prevention would eventually require. Pinchot had trained in European forestry methods before returning to the United States to build a professional forestry practice largely without American precedent to draw on, and the agency he shaped in the Forest Service's earliest years reflected that European influence in its emphasis on scientific management and systematic land use planning. Fire, in this framework, represented a threat to be managed and minimized rather than a natural process the forest itself might have evolved alongside, a perspective that would come to define federal wildfire policy for most of the following century. By 1908, only 3 years after its creation, the Forest Service had grown to roughly 1,500 employees, overseeing some 150 million acres of public land, an expansion of responsibility that outpaced the agency's practical capacity to monitor and respond to fire risk across such an enormous and geographically scattered territory. This gap between the scale of the Forest Service's mandate and its actual operational capacity would prove decisive when the fires of 1910 arrived. The big blow-up of 1910 struck this young agency at a moment when it was still working out its basic operational identity, and the scale of the disaster, combined with the deaths of so many of the Forest Service's own firefighters, created a political urgency that decades of conservationist argument alone had not been able to generate. Where Peshtigo's dead had been largely immigrant laborers in a remote lumber town, the 1910 fire's victims included federal employees killed in the line of duty, a distinction that mattered enormously in how Congress and the national press treated the disaster's aftermath. Newspaper coverage of the 1910 fire reached a national audience with a speed and consistency that Peshtigo's story had never achieved, in part because the victims included government employees whose deaths carried an institutional weight private citizens in a remote lumber town simply had not commanded 4 decades earlier. Congressional hearings followed within months, drawing directly on testimony from surviving Forest Service personnel and producing a public record of exactly the kind of sustained official attention that Peshtigo's disaster, despite its far higher death toll, had never received. Within a year of the big blow-up, Congress passed the Weeks Act of 1911, legislation that established a formal framework for cooperation between federal and state governments in forest fire protection, while also authorizing the federal government to purchase private forest land for conservation purposes across the eastern United States. Signed into law by President William Howard Taft, the Weeks Act gave the Forest Service both expanded authority and expanded resources to pursue exactly the kind of systematic fire management that had not existed anywhere in the country when the fire reached Peshtigo 4 decades earlier. The legislation appropriated several $million for the purchase of forest land in the eastern United States, land that would become the foundation for many of the national forests that exist across that region today, and it established for the first time a formal legal mechanism through which federal and state governments could coordinate fire prevention and suppression efforts across jurisdictional lines. Before the Weeks Act, a fire crossing from private land onto federal land, or from one state into another, faced no organized framework for a unified response, a gap in coordination that had contributed to the scale of destruction in both 1871 and 1910. The bill's path through Congress had, notably, faced years of resistance before the 1910 fires provided the political urgency needed to finally secure its passage. More than 40 separate bills proposing federal forest protection in the eastern states had been introduced and rejected by Congress in the decade before the Weeks Act finally succeeded, a legislative history that illustrates just how much political weight a catastrophe on the scale of the big blow-up carried, compared to the accumulated warnings of conservationists working without a comparably dramatic recent disaster to point to. The policy that emerged from this legislation, refined over the following decades, settled on an approach that would come to define American forest management for most of the 20th century. Total suppression, the treatment of every wildfire, regardless of size or location, as an emergency to be extinguished as quickly as possible. By 1935, the Forest Service had formalized this approach into an explicit operational standard, directing that every reported fire be brought under control by 10 o'clock the morning after it was first spotted, a policy that would guide American wildfire management for the next several decades. This standard, which came to be known informally within the agency as the 10 o'clock policy, reflected a genuine institutional confidence that the primary obstacle to eliminating destructive wildfire was simply a shortage of manpower and resources for rapid initial response. Forest Service leadership in this era, many of them men who had themselves served as wildland firefighters earlier in their careers, brought a firefighter's operational mindset into agency policy, treating every fire as a problem to be solved through faster detection and more aggressive early suppression, rather than through any broader reconsideration of how fire functioned within a forest ecosystem. This suppression-focused approach produced, in the near term, exactly the outcome its architects intended: a substantial reduction in the total acreage burned by wildfire across the country's forests each year, and a corresponding reduction in the kind of catastrophic, fast-moving fire event that had destroyed Peshtigo. For much of the 20th century, American forest policy could reasonably claim to have solved the specific problem that had killed more than 1,000 people in a single night in 1871. Investment in firefighting infrastructure grew steadily across this period, with the Forest Service building networks of fire lookout towers, forest roads, and radio communication systems specifically designed to detect and respond to new fires within hours rather than days. The agency's public relations efforts during this era, including the launch of the Smoky Bear Fire Prevention Campaign in 1944, reinforced a simple, widely adopted message: that wildfire was fundamentally a preventable accident, something individual human carelessness caused and individual human vigilance could stop. That message proved remarkably effective at shaping public attitudes toward fire for generations of Americans, embedding itself deeply enough in popular culture that the character remains recognizable today, more than 80 years after the campaign's launch. Its underlying premise, however, told only part of the story, framing fire prevention almost entirely around human ignition sources, while saying comparatively little about the accumulated natural fuel that made any spark, human-caused or otherwise, capable of growing into something far larger than the original source of ignition. A generation of Americans raised on this message understood wildfire primarily as a matter of individual carelessness, an unextinguished campfire, a discarded cigarette, without necessarily understanding the deeper structural condition, a century of accumulated fuel building silently in forests, never allowed to burn on their own natural schedule, that made any spark so much more dangerous than it would otherwise have been. What total suppression could not do, and what forest scientists would only come to fully understand in the latter decades of the 20th century, was eliminate the underlying fuel load that natural, smaller fires had historically cleared on a regular basis. Forests that had evolved alongside periodic low-intensity fires, fires that cleared undergrowth and deadwood without threatening mature trees, were denied that natural cycle for decades under a policy that treated every ignition as a failure to be corrected rather than a process to be managed. Many forest ecosystems across North America had, for thousands of years before European settlement, burned regularly at low intensity. Whether through lightning strikes or through deliberate burning practices used by indigenous communities to manage game habitat and encourage useful plant growth. These periodic fires consumed the accumulated deadwood, fallen branches, and undergrowth that would otherwise build up year after year, functioning as a kind of natural maintenance system that kept any single fire's available fuel within manageable limits. Decades of total suppression interrupted this cycle across millions of acres of forest, allowing exactly the kind of fuel accumulation that had made the pine belt around Peshtigo so dangerous in 1871 to build up again, this time across public forest land under active federal management rather than land shaped by unregulated logging. The very success of early suppression efforts, in other words, planted the conditions for a different kind of long-term problem, one that would not become fully apparent until accumulated fuel loads reached a scale capable of overwhelming even a well-resourced, professionally staffed firefighting agency. The consequence of this decades-long suppression policy became increasingly visible by the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as forests across the American West accumulated fuel loads far beyond anything a pre-suppression landscape would have carried, setting the stage for wildfires that, when they did eventually break through suppression efforts, burned with an intensity and speed that echoed the conditions Peshtigo's residents had faced in 1871. Modern wildfire science now recognizes what 19th century Peshtigo could not have articulated in these terms, that drought, accumulated fuel, and wind can combine to produce fire behavior that exceeds any reasonable human capacity to contain it directly, and that the only effective long-term strategy involves managing fuel loads before ignition occurs, rather than attempting total suppression after the fact. This understanding, developed over more than a century of forest science and painful, repeated experience, traces a direct intellectual line back to the questions Peshtigo first forced American conservationists to confront, even if the specific policy response took decades to arrive and additional decades more to recognize its own limitations. Contemporary forest management increasingly incorporates prescribed burning, the deliberate, controlled use of low-intensity fire to reduce accumulated fuel loads under conditions chosen specifically to minimize risk, a practice that represents, in some respects, a return to the kind of periodic burning cycle that suppression-era policy had interrupted for most of the 20th century. This shift did not happen quickly or without resistance, since a century of public messaging built around preventing all fire had shaped popular expectations in ways that made a policy of deliberately setting fires, even carefully controlled ones, a difficult case to make to a public trained to view any wildfire as an unambiguous emergency. The scientific consensus supporting this shift developed gradually through repeated observation of fire behavior in forests where suppression had been practiced for decades compared against forests, often on tribal or wilderness land where more natural fire cycles had been permitted to continue with less interference. These comparative studies consistently showed that forests denied their natural fire cycle carried substantially higher fuel loads, and, when fire did eventually reach them, burned with correspondingly greater intensity and were correspondingly harder to control. Indigenous fire management traditions, largely dismissed or actively suppressed by federal land managers throughout much of the 20th century, have in recent decades received renewed scientific and policy attention precisely because they preserved, in practice, a working model of the kind of periodic, low-intensity burning that suppression-era forestry had spent generations trying to eliminate entirely. The pattern that made Peshtigo's story disappear behind a more prominent disaster on the same night has, in a different form, repeated itself in the century and a half since. Modern wildfires that strike rural communities, tribal lands, or economically marginal regions still tend to receive less sustained national attention than comparable disasters affecting wealthier, more media-connected areas, following the same basic logic of press infrastructure and economic stakes that once left Peshtigo in Chicago's shadow. This pattern is not simply a historical curiosity confined to the 19th century. Major national news events, whether political, economic, or otherwise, have on more than one occasion in recent decades competed for public attention with a wildfire disaster unfolding at the same time. The result has been a version of the same imbalance that shaped how the country remembered October 8th, 1871, a community that loses its homes and, in the worst cases, its residents to wildfire on a day when other news dominates the national conversation, faces a version of the same obscurity that swallowed Peshtigo's story for a century and a half. Communities facing wildfire risk today, particularly in the wildland-urban interface zones where residential development has expanded into fire-prone forest and grassland, inherit conditions that would be recognizable to a resident of Peshtigo in October 1871. Wood construction, dense vegetation, and a regional climate trending toward longer and more severe drought conditions in many parts of the American West. The specific technologies have changed, but the underlying physics of drought, fuel, and wind that destroyed Peshtigo remain exactly what they were a century and a half ago. The growth of housing development into these fire-prone zones has in recent decades placed steadily larger numbers of people and structures directly in the path of exactly the kind of fire behavior that Peshtigo demonstrated, even as fire science has grown more sophisticated in its understanding of how to manage that risk. This tension between expanding development in vulnerable landscapes and an improving but still imperfect science of fire prevention defines much of the ongoing wildfire policy debate in the American West today, a debate whose roots trace back, in a direct if often unacknowledged line, to the lessons a forgotten Wisconsin lumber town first offered the country in 1871. What has changed, at least in principle, is the existence of an institutional framework, a forest service, a body of fire science, an evolving understanding of controlled burns and fuel management, built directly in response to the kind of disaster Peshtigo represented, even though that framework took decades to develop and continues to be tested and sometimes found wanting by fires that outpace even a modern nation's capacity to predict, manage, and contain them. Modern firefighting agencies now have access to satellite monitoring, weather prediction models capable of identifying dangerous fire conditions days in advance, and coordinated multi-agency response systems that a 19th century lumber town could not have imagined. These tools have undeniably prevented countless fires from reaching the scale that consumed Peshtigo, intercepting dangerous conditions and mobilizing resources with a speed and precision that stands in sharp contrast to the total absence of warning residents experienced on the night of October 8, 1871. Yet even the most advanced modern firefighting capability remains, in the most extreme cases, subject to the same basic physical limits that overwhelmed Peshtigo's bucket brigade a century and a half ago. When drought, fuel, and wind combine at sufficient scale, the resulting fire can still move faster than any evacuation order, any fire break, or any aircraft can reliably contain, a reality that modern communities in high-risk zones continue to confront despite every advance in fire science and emergency response infrastructure developed in the decades since 1871. The town of Peshtigo itself was rebuilt in the years following the fire, on the same site along the same river, by survivors and new arrivals who chose to remain in a place that had, within living memory, been reduced to ash within the span of a single night. Its history, and the history of the 16 or more surrounding communities the fire destroyed, remains recorded today primarily in local historical societies, a small museum, and a cemetery holding the unnamed dead, rather than in the kind of prominent national memory that a disaster of comparable scale, occurring under different circumstances, might otherwise have earned. Rebuilding a town on the exact ground where so many neighbors and family members had died required a specific kind of resolve from the survivors who chose to stay, a decision shaped as much by practical necessity as by sentiment, since the region's economy and the survivors' own livelihoods remained tied to the same river, the same forest, and the same lumber trade that had drawn the original settlement there in the first place. The new Peshtigo that emerged in the years after 1871 carried forward the same basic economic logic as the town that had burned, though the specific practices around forest management and fire risk would, over subsequent decades, gradually shift under the influence of the broader policy changes the disaster had helped set in motion. The quiet of that history does not diminish what happened there. It only means that remembering it now requires a deliberate act of attention that the disaster itself, on the night it happened, was never given the chance to receive. A visitor to the modern town can still walk to the cemetery where the unidentified dead were laid to rest, Still read the names recorded on the smaller markers surrounding that larger, unmarked grave. Still stand at the edge of the river that once held hundreds of people through a night no one there had any way of preparing for. The physical traces remain, quiet and largely unvisited, waiting for whatever attention each new generation chooses to give them. The fire is quiet now. The forest has grown back, tall and green, over ground that once burned hot enough to melt iron. Somewhere beneath that new growth, the roots still remember the shape of the old one. This has been Quiet History at Bedtime. If you found value in this story, a subscribe, a like, or turning on notifications helps this channel keep telling the histories that go untold. Thank you for listening and for letting this play through to the end. Good night and sleep well.